Hey everyone, so today we're going to discuss a topic that's related to improving your conditioning. So if you're an athlete or a coach or maybe a strength and conditioning professional, you're gonna want to have some type of conditioning program in your athletes, right? Unless you're doing like a 100-meter track athlete, which to some degree you're still gonna need it. But if you participate in a sport like basketball, soccer, American football, rugby, hockey, volleyball, basketball, those types of sports, those are what we term intermittent sports, where they require athletes to repeat high-intensity bouts of effort over a long period of time, right? So if you're a soccer athlete, you're going to have to sprint to a ball and then it gets kicked out of bounds. You might have, 5-10 seconds to recover before you might need to sprint again. So we want to make sure that our conditioning is allowing our athletes to recover relatively quickly so they can produce these high-intensity bouts of effort without that big of a decrement later on in the game, in the half, in the quarter, where it really matters. We want to make sure that drop off or that decrement of performance is as low as possible, right? We don't want just an athlete that is great in the first half, very explosive, and then second half they lose all that power because they can't produce it due to their lack of conditioning. So what we're going to talk about today is a brand new paper published ahead of print from the NSCA. And the title is Effect of Work to Rest Ratio on Cycling Performance Following Sprint Interval Training. A randomized control trial, and the lead author is Molly C. Lloyd-Jones. Again, this was just published 2019 ahead of print, so you can check it out online if you want. So what they looked at, and let's just kind of get all the variables here. They had 36 male and female participants. Typically, in a lot of research, you're only going to see male, so this is kind of cool to see that they included female participants. What they did was they did 10 sets of 6-second all-out sprints, and then each of the three groups, the actual groups, the intervention groups, had different rest periods between those 6 seconds of 6-second intervals. So one group had a 1-to-8 work to rest ratio. So actually, what does that mean? Think of work to rest ratio. A lot of people have heard the term Tabata. Tabata is a 1-to-2 work to rest ratio, because you're going to be doing some activity for 10 seconds of work. Let's just say on a bike, you're going to sprint for 10 seconds and then you're going to recover for 20 seconds. So you're doubling the amount of time. So therefore it's a 1 work to 2 rest ratio. So these different conditions were going to be a 1-to-8. So they sprinted for 6 seconds and they recovered for 48 seconds, did that 10 times. Second group did 6 seconds of all-out sprint, followed by 60 seconds of recovery, 10 sets, and the last group did 6 seconds of all-out sprints. Then they rested for 22 seconds and they did that 10 times. All three groups completed 1 minute of sprint work. They all did 10 sets of 6-second all-out sprints, so they all did the same amount of work. They just had different recovery work period or rest periods. It lasted 2 weeks. They had 3 sessions a week, so only a total of 6 sessions. So right off the bat, let me just say all three actually improved levels of performance, which is kind of interesting. In only a short period of time of 2 weeks, only 6 total training sessions, they improved their peak power, their mean power, and their time trial are the 3 things that were their measurements as far as the study goes. However, within those 3 groups, there wasn't a statistically significant difference in mean power, peak power output, or the time trial that they use, and even heart rate monitoring, they didn't find a statistically significant difference. So that's pretty interesting, because I remember when I first saw this research article and I was just looking through the abstract, I automatically assumed that the 1-to-8 work to rest ratio was probably going to have a bigger drop off in peak and probably mean power output than the 1-to-12, only because I'm like, all right, the 1-to-8 is only resting 48 seconds. The 1-to-12 gets 72 seconds. I figured there'd probably be a decrement. But again, when they ran the statistics, there wasn't a significant difference between all 3 conditions. So what does that mean? So that means essentially, if you're a coach, you have a little bit of different styles that of work to rest ratios that you can choose from to work with your athletes and get very similar results. Now, if you want to do a 1-to-8, you can do that. So if you're really restricted with time as far as your practice, your schedule, do a 1-to-8 work to rest ratio, and that should only take you probably like 5 or 6 minutes total of conditioning, and you can still get some improvements. If you have some, maybe you're just getting your team back from the off season, you don't want to, tax them too much, then maybe you choose the 1-to-12 ratio. You give them a little extra time to develop their aerobic system, and as you get a little bit more into the season, your athletes get more fit aerobically, then maybe you move it into a 1-to-10, and then you stay there for a few weeks, and then you move it to a 1-to-8, so you can kind of periodize your work to rest ratio depending on where you're at during the season. Now, it's interesting that it only lasted 2 weeks, this study. Now, long term, we don't necessarily know what would be if there would be differences between all three conditions. To me, I think the 1-to-8 at some point is probably gonna tax the aerobic system a lot harder than the 1-to-12, because you're not giving it hardly any time to replenish ATP stores, so it relies heavily on the aerobic system to resynthesize ATP. So long term, I would think the 1-to-8 might have a little bit more advantage if you're trying to develop the aerobic system. But again, in 2 weeks, not that big of a difference. So it kind of allows you as a coach, or if you want to give your athletes kind of homework assignment when they're not with you, you can tell them, hey, when you're gonna, go find a hill, sprint as hard as you can for 6 seconds, and take anywhere from 48 to 72 seconds of rest periods, depending on what you want as an athlete, whatever feels best to you, and do that 10 times, and you're not gonna get that big of a decrement. So maybe someone's out of shape, 48 might be a little hard for them to be able to produce that 6 seconds of all-out sprint. So give them the 72-second option, and maybe that works a lot better for them. So that's why I like knowing that there's not that big of a difference between these three work to rest ratios, so it allows me to give that athlete a little bit more freedom to let them choose. So they can put a timer. If they're ready after 55 seconds, go for it. If they need a little bit longer, up to that 72, the 1-to-12 ratio, do that as well. So that's pretty good to know that you can give that athlete that freedom. So again, kind of to sum it up, is whether you're using a 1-to-8, 1-to-10, 1-to-12 work to rest ratio. Again, this is using a 6-second all-out sprint. Not that big of a difference as far as peak power, mean power output, and they did a time trial as well, and there was no statistically significant differences between those three conditions. Along with heart rate, they measured heart rate, and there wasn't that statistically significant between the three conditions as well. So I think that's an important thing to notice. I hope down the road we see some long-term interventions, some long-term studies to see if we carry this out into maybe a 3-month training program, does that differ? And that allows us to strategize and know where we can kind of periodize these work to rest ratios depending on where we're at during the season. If we're maybe a little further out, we're in the off season, we're okay with giving them longer rest periods to develop the system, and then we can periodize and shorten it up as we get closer to the season. We can shorten up the rest period, and so on and so on. That's typically what I like to do with my athletes, is as we get closer and we want to tax that conditioning and improve a very robust and resilient conditioning training effect, I'm going to shorten up those rest periods. So hopefully this helped. If whether you're an athlete or a coach, you can see how changing these things sometimes has a big pronounced effect, sometimes not so much. It gives you a different perspective. As always, you can drop a comment or a question, whether in the comment section or shoot me a direct message, and I'll be more than willing to engage in a conversation with you. So I'm Coach Jerry. Till next time, we're out of here.